Hello everyone, welcome to another show of the China Hipster podcast. This will be our 13th episode. Today our guest is Ning Leng, a PhD student of political science at the University of Wisconsin Madison. She is the starter of the China Salon here, which you can find on Facebook under the Chinese name 麦城中国研究学术沙龙. She has been a resident of Madison for 5 years now, where this interview takes place. Her current dissertation is on the reform of ownership structures in several sectors in China, such as public transportation, water treatment, and postal services. Both Ning and I took the summer Hindi language course here, University of Wisconsin Madison. I just finished it last week and found it very engaging and helpful. Ning completed her course in 2012. Coincidentally, her TA became the main instructor of beginners Hindi this year, and we had several overlaps in terms of interests and research topics. Welcome to the show, Ning.
Hello, everybody. This is Ning.
So, Ning, how did you first become interested in India?
I guess it had to do with my dad's interest. He was interested in Buddhism and Hinduism and religious readings, so I was involved as a child reading those books. That's how it all began.
Does your dad also work in academia?
No, he's a writer, a freelancer.
Wow. And what was one of your favorite books before you entered the field as a researcher?
My favorite books? I was very interested in tons of novels, like Russian novels. I like stories from Buddhism and Hinduism. Hard to name just one book, but those are the major readings I like.
Yeah, for me as well, I think my interest in India also started from the religious aspect, although now it's shifted to the historical aspects. I also learned that you had done some research in Kerala.
Yes.
Which year?
2010.
You've done research in Kerala in 2010. And what was the subject of the research?
It was to study governance under Communist Party, because that was one of the only 2 states in India that had a Communist Party government. The other is West Bengal. So I went to Kerala, and the main reason is to have a comparison study between Kerala and some coastal services in China, like Guangdong and Fujian.
Under mainstream political science conceptions, communism and communist parties seem to be a monolithic category. However, in your research, you didn't find as many similarities between communist parties in Kerala and the communist party presence in Guangdong and southern China.
I would say the biggest difference is how does the government view themselves? Like in China, Chinese government does not have the sense of competition. So they feel like whatever they do, for example, social welfare programs, they feel like they're doing a favor. But in Kerala, the government actually is facing democratic institutional competition. So what they do, they feel like it's a way to gain votes. So the motivation is very different, actually resulting in difference in quality too. Kerala has the highest quality of social welfare in the whole India, even though it's one of the poorest regions. So that was a surprising thing to see how institutions actually shape the outcome of social welfare provision.
So even by institutional structure, you found differences between the both titled communist regimes in Kerala and China.
I think the biggest difference is when you have an institutional constraint, which is democratic competition. Working for people, providing social welfare became the sole selling point for a communist party. They need a better identification strategy as a party. In China, the Communist Party does not have this constraint. So marketing, economic growth became their biggest selling point. So even though they're both communist parties and they both think they work for the people, they do have different focus on their policies.
Yeah, I think that was a shift since the marketization policies in China that the GDP would be the main point of legitimacy. So in Kerala, you saw a stronger emphasis on social welfare.
Absolutely, yes. Economic development is actually their opponents' major strategy, but not theirs.
Their opponents being
Congress
Party.
Yeah. For the Kerala Communist Party, the focus has always been on redistribution, on social welfare, on education, that kind of social programs.
So would you say that they are truer to the sense of communism in their name?
It's an interesting question. I would think so. They actually call themselves Marxist Socialist Party. So, yeah, I think so.
What were some of the interesting points in your research that you would like to highlight?
I think the most interesting difference is between how people view Communist Party. In Kerala, people genuinely believe that Communist Party is...
And you interviewed people in Kerala?
Villagers, yes, mostly rural villagers. And they actually believe that Communist Party is the party for the people. They believe in the whole Marxism ideology that you don't see anymore in China.
And aside from interviewing people, did you also look at newspapers? What were the other sources for
academic
research?
papers, talking to professors, talking to a few businessmen in Kerala, talking to middle-class people, and they were more confident in their economic development.
Even under a communist party rule?
And even in a poor state in India, yes, they're more confident about their future.
Because when I visited Kolkata in West Bengal, they also had experienced the rule of the Communist Party for several decades, but during that time they were transitioning to a different leader under a different party. They suffered from the bad name of stifling development and too much red tape, and a lot of business fled to Bombay from Kolkata in the 60s, 70s. So you didn't see bad-mouthing of the government in Kerala from businessmen when you interviewed them?
Oh, there was a lot of those. Businessmen didn't like the Communist Party. But the thing is, in a poor state, the biggest voter base is actually poorer people. Kerala has a lot of them. So that's why Communist Party can win. They didn't always win. It's almost like they rotate turns with Congress. Actually, I find their rotation, in a paper I wrote, I said that rotation, different from West Bengal, was probably the reason why Kerala has reached a balance in economic development and social welfare development.
Yeah, in West Bengal, they ruled consecutively for many decades, and that was probably the reason why businesses found that it was less hospitable.
Which is amazing to me, because West Bengal actually had a longer tradition of business development. If you think about Calcutta as an important trade port, so that was a puzzling thing to me why Communist Party had been consecutively winning terms.
You didn't consider that as your comparison for the paper?
I did for a while, but then my focus is, after all, on China, so I didn't spend more time on the topic.
And I learned that you presented this paper at 2 separate conferences. Could you speak on that?
So one of them is Midwest Political Association's conference in Chicago, and I presented it at the governance session, and I got some questions from several Indian faculties that I thought was very interesting. Because my conclusion is that the two-party rotation has reached a balance in development in Kerala. They were asking me, what do I think about three-party system versus two-party system? And if I believe that two-party system is the best for a democratic regime. But I have no answer to that. I just find that question very intriguing.
There are very few Chinese scholars who actively do research in contemporary India. So how has this research played out in your academic career?
I think India will always be part of my research. Be it, an independent project or a chapter in my coming dissertation, I've always involved it because India and China actually share a lot of similarities. The starting point of their economic condition, the population, obviously, the size, they're large countries. But because of different institutions, you see very different trajectories in these two countries' development. So I think it's important for Chinese to learn about India and look at it without any bias or prejudice or preconditions. Unfortunately, though, we don't have many Chinese scholars studying India right now, which is puzzling too.
As a future graduate student studying on India from the perspective of Chinese politics, I agree with you that there are a lot of similarities between China and India. I think both face the issue of agriculture and how to sustain an economy for such a large population, but they took totally different trajectories. Although both emphasized on state planning during the 60s and 70s, they also had very different results. And I've heard different conferences recently about this subject, but I've never heard many Chinese scholars making these comparisons. It's usually from Indian scholars. I don't know if you've received a lot of feedback from scholars of both nationalities or...
That's an actually interesting question because so far, most of the encouragement I receive for doing a China-India comparison is from India faculties rather than China faculties. I'm not sure why. My immature impression, could be wrong, is that some Chinese scholars did tell me that they don't think China and India are very comparable. Because of institution, number one, and second is we are at very different economic development phase. China is quite developed right now, market economy, but India is not as developed. And
Is
also,
that your opinion, or are those the opinions of Chinese scholars?
right now, I would say yes. China is, let's say, doing better, quote better, economic-wise. But in the long run, I'm not sure if this will always be the case.
Some cite the demographic differences as the major advantage for the Indian economy because currently there are a larger number of youth in India rather than China's triangle demography. Would you add any other factors that India would soon become a more mature market economy?
I think so. The demographic feature is absolutely an important thing that we need to take consideration of. The other important thing is property rights. So if we don't have enough property rights protection scheme, if we don't have a mature legal institution, that will be harmful to economic development in the end. And I would say India is ahead of us. One interesting phenomenon I did notice is young people in India are more confident about their future compared to Chinese young people. Chinese young people worry a lot about if they can afford a house, if they can actually, get married, if they don't have enough property. But those things seems to me to be a lesser concern for the Indian youth. So they're more confident and they're happier about their future.
Yeah, a comment about the property rights. I've also noticed this difference in which when Chinese tourists tour cities like Mumbai, they would be baffled at the large presence of slums in Mumbai. Whereas in China, if you have unregulated urban sprawl, the government can easily demolish it. So when Chinese people tour it, they don't understand that it's also because the slum dwellers have a certain right to the land, even though the city might not have warranted it, the city government still cannot violently demolish the slum area, even though it does happen in some areas, but it's not as prevalent as it happens in China.
Absolutely. The existence of slum is always the most cited reason that why China is superior to India in terms of development strategy they adopted. But to me, slums have its problems, induce a lot of city planning problems, maybe, safety problems, maybe, but it doesn't mean that making the poor invisible is a solution to the problem.
Right.
And also, when we compare China and India's economic development, there are many similarities, especially in weakness. For example, the threat of corruption. For example, environmental pollution. Both countries are notorious for these two. But on the other hand, if you look at the software that the development really needed, for example, financial institutions, India is far ahead of China. To this date, I cannot use my international credit card in China everywhere I want. But even in Kerala, in some less developed areas, I could have done that easily. For example, telecommunication, cell phone plans, internet charges in China is very high, and they in some degree block information flow. But in India, those charges are very cheap, and everybody has access to it.
So I've also found that the prevalence of microfinance in India, to respond to your comment about financial services, is a very inspiring aspect of the civil society in India and the extent to which they support certain endeavors of the lower class people to invest in their lives. Although there was a presentation given by recently retired Professor Joe Esherick at my undergrad college, Claremont McKenna, in which he proposed that China has surpassed India in terms of market economy because China has allowed for greater female mobility and female participation in the workforce. A large number of garment factories or electronic factories are actually employ more women than men. So did you have any observations about women's rights in Kerala?
Kerala is probably an exception because it's famous for women's movement, and I think they have the highest employment rate for female group, if I remember it correctly, in the whole India. And there are a lot of NGOs that are like women's self-help organizations. So my experience in Kerala was women there are fairly respected compared to other states, and there are more women in the labor force. And also I noticed that dowry, in my limited interviews, of course, people didn't think dowry is an important thing. no longer for the Kerala girls to get married with or without dowry. And some families choose to have only one girl rather than, have sons. So, I don't know. That's an exceptional state on this aspect.
Yes, Kerala is indeed the exception. Although, if you had future opportunities, would you be interested in researching in other states of India?
Oh, absolutely. So I'm going to start my fieldwork very soon in 2015, mostly in China, but I'm hoping at the end of my fieldwork, I'll add India as a case study to compare to China's sectoral ownership structure change.
In the similar industries, such as public transportation?
Yeah, public transportation, postal services, water treatment, maybe energy. So I'm still considering which sectors to study.
Yeah, in the recent elections, one of the candidates of the Aam Aadmi Party, Arvind Kejriwal, made this a huge issue of his campaign. He accused the main opposition, BJP party, of remaining silent over the issue of raising gas prices. Arvind Kejriwal claimed that it was caused by the business magnate Mukesh Ambani and even filed a first investigation against Mukesh Ambani. And you see that in India there is a degree of transparency in which a person could file an investigation against a major state-owned enterprise owner or business magnate. But you also see trends similar to China in which there is collusion between politicians and business people in the state-owned enterprises.
Oh, absolutely. Corruption is a big problem in India, that's undoubtedly. It's also a problem in China, but this is what I try to find out. So there is research showing that corruption actually happens less between the state and the public-owned enterprises than the state and private enterprises. Private business firms are usually easier targets for rent-seeking for politicians. So my research is really about how corruption and other factors contribute to the ownership structure of a market in a certain sector. The difference in India and China is this. So in China, a lot of sectors are purely state-owned. A few of them are open to private in the public service market. In India, we see more private players on these markets. So the comparison provides us with an insight of how different economic and political factors contribute to the formation of a market in terms of private and public-owned enterprises on the market.
Certainly, in my own research experience, I've also seen similarities between India's 2G spectrum scam that was investigated in 2011 and some of the corruption charges against China Telecom officials, and both involved the collusion between businessmen and party officials / politicians in China and India. So I look forward to your research in this regard. Would you like to add anything else about your hopes for the research?
I'll do the best as I can.
Thank you so much for being on the China Hipster podcast, Ning.
Thank you.